Please don't tell anyone you used to clean office bathrooms tonight. Those were the first words my daughter-in-law said to me before my son's company gala even started. I stood frozen beside the marble entrance of the Grand Mercer Hotel in Manhattan, while Olivia adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist like she had not just humiliated me in front of 3 valet attendants. For a second, I honestly thought maybe I misunderstood her. But then she smiled politely and leaned closer. I just mean, tonight is very important for Ethan's image. Ethan's image. Not Ethan himself. Not our family. Just the image. I looked down at my navy blue dress that I bought on clearance at Macy's 2 years ago and quietly nodded like her comment did not hurt. The truth was, I had already spent 3 hours worrying that my clothes were not elegant enough for this event. Every woman walking through those giant glass doors looked like she belonged in a luxury magazine. Expensive heels clicked across polished marble floors while men in black tuxedos laughed beside massive crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet overhead. Even the air smelled expensive somehow. Meanwhile, I still felt like the same woman who spent 27 years scrubbing office floors in downtown Cleveland after midnight shifts. Olivia glanced toward the ballroom entrance nervously. There are going to be investors here tonight. Senior partners, too. Then her eyes moved toward my handbag. And maybe keep your purse under the table. I looked at the old leather purse hanging from my shoulder. The corners were worn because I had carried it for nearly 8 years. Suddenly, I felt embarrassed by something as small as a purse. Of course, I whispered softly. Olivia immediately smiled again once she realized I was cooperating. Perfect. Thank you, Margaret. Then she walked ahead of me in her silver gown while greeting guests like she owned the building. I followed quietly behind her into the ballroom, already feeling smaller with every step. The room was enormous. At least 300 people filled the space beneath golden ceiling lights, while waiters carried trays of champagne between tables covered in white roses and glowing candles. At the center of the ballroom stood a giant LED screen displaying my son's face beside the words Future Partner Announcement. My chest tightened with pride the second I saw it. Ethan Hayes, my son, the little boy I used to walk 4 blocks to school every morning because we could not afford a second car. The same boy who studied beside me at laundromats while I folded uniforms for my second job. Tonight, he was becoming one of the youngest senior partners in the history of one of the largest consulting firms in New York City. I wanted to cry from happiness. But before I could even take another step, Olivia suddenly touched my arm gently and pointed toward the far back corner of the ballroom. Your table is over there, she said casually. I followed her finger and saw table 39 sitting beside the service doors near the kitchen hallway. My smile faded instantly. Every executive and family member sat near the stage under the bright ballroom lights. But my seat was hidden beside the catering station where servers carried dirty dishes back and forth. For a moment, I honestly thought maybe there had been some mistake. Oh, I said quietly. I thought I might sit closer to Ethan tonight. Olivia gave a tiny, uncomfortable laugh. Well, the front tables are mostly reserved for company leadership. Then she lowered her voice slightly. This arrangement just makes things easier. Easier. I nodded slowly again, even though something inside my chest already felt painfully heavy. Across the ballroom, I spotted Ethan laughing beside several executives near the stage. He looked confident, successful, happy. For one brief second, I hoped he would notice me standing there alone and immediately come over. Instead, he simply gave me a quick smile from across the room before turning back toward the investors beside him. And somehow that hurt even more than Olivia's words. Table 39 felt less like part of the celebration and more like a waiting area nobody wanted to acknowledge. From my seat near the swinging kitchen doors, I could hear silver trays clattering behind the walls every few minutes while waiters rushed past carrying champagne glasses worth more than my weekly grocery bill. The farther I looked across the ballroom, the clearer the divide became. Near the stage, executives laughed beneath warm golden lighting while photographers moved from table to table capturing polished smiles and expensive watches. Back where I sat, the lighting felt dimmer somehow. Quieter. Easier to ignore. I carefully folded my hands in my lap and tried convincing myself none of this mattered because tonight was supposed to be about Ethan's success, not my feelings. But the longer I sat there alone, the harder that became. A young waiter stopped beside my table carrying sparkling water. "Would you like a glass, ma'am?" he asked politely. Before I could answer, a woman seated nearby looked up from her phone and asked, "Wait, are you Ethan Hayes' mother?" Her tone sounded surprised rather than warm. I nodded politely. "Yes, I am." The woman blinked twice like she expected someone different. She wore an emerald green dress and diamond earrings that flashed every time she turned her head. "Oh, wow," she said slowly. "I thought his parents lived in Connecticut or something." I forced a small smile. "No, Cleveland." Another guest leaned slightly toward the table. "So what did you do professionally?" The question itself sounded harmless, but something about the sudden silence afterward made me uncomfortable. I hesitated for half a second before answering honestly. "I worked several jobs over the years." "Like what?" The woman pressed curiously. "Mostly custodial work," I admitted quietly. "Office buildings, school cafeterias, cleaning contracts downtown." The woman's expression shifted immediately. Not openly cruel. Worse, sympathetic. The kind of sympathy people use when they're trying not to look uncomfortable. "Oh," she said softly. "That must have been difficult." I nodded once. "Sometimes." Another man seated farther down the table gave an awkward laugh while adjusting his tuxedo cufflinks. "Well, clearly it paid off," he joked, lightly while motioning toward Ethan near the stage. A few people smiled politely, but nobody really knew what to say after that. Within seconds, the conversation shifted away from me completely and returned to stock markets, vacation homes, and private schools in Connecticut. I sat quietly while pretending to watch the stage, but deep down I realized something painful. They were relieved the conversation had moved on because I made the atmosphere feel less polished, less comfortable. Across the ballroom, I noticed Olivia standing beside a group of executives near the bar. Her smile looked effortless as she laughed at something one of the men said. Every movement about her seemed practiced for rooms like this. Elegant posture, perfect hair, controlled expressions. Then one of the executives glanced briefly toward my table and appeared to ask her something. Olivia looked over at me for less than 2 seconds before giving a soft laugh. Even from across the ballroom, I could tell the conversation was about me. The woman beside her covered her mouth politely while smiling. Another man shook his head like he found the situation amusing. My stomach tightened immediately. I tried telling myself I was imagining things until Olivia spoke slightly louder. She still shops at discount department stores because she refuses to spend money on herself, she joked. The group laughed softly together. Honestly, she probably hates being here tonight. Fancy events make her nervous. More quiet laughter followed. My face burned so quickly I could physically feel the heat rising into my cheeks. I lowered my eyes toward the white tablecloth and pretended not to hear any of it. Across the room, Ethan glanced toward the group for a moment. I waited for him to step in. I waited for him to defend me. Instead, he simply smiled awkwardly and took another sip of his drink while the conversation continued around him like nothing was wrong. And that was the exact moment something inside me quietly started breaking. The awards presentation started 20 minutes later, but by then I already wanted to disappear. Soft piano music echoed through the ballroom, while giant screens displayed photos of smiling executives beside company growth charts and applause-filled headlines from business magazines. Every few minutes another name was announced, followed by cheers and expensive-sounding speeches about innovation, leadership, and vision. I clapped politely with everyone else, but my attention kept drifting toward Ethan near the stage. He looked completely at home up there beneath the bright lights. Confident, respected, important. Watching him should have filled me with pride. Instead, I felt strangely distant from him tonight, like there was suddenly a wall between the life he lived now and the life we came from. A server placed a small salad in front of me while guests around the ballroom continued networking between speeches. Nobody at my table really spoke to me anymore after learning what kind of jobs I used to work. I noticed the difference immediately. Earlier, they at least asked polite questions. Now, they barely looked in my direction at all. I quietly unfolded my napkin and tried focusing on my meal when sudden laughter erupted near the front of the ballroom again. Instinctively, I glanced up. Olivia stood beside two senior executives and a woman wearing a white designer pantsuit near the champagne tower. One of the men appeared to ask another question about me, because Olivia immediately smiled and motioned casually toward table 39. "That is Ethan's mother," she explained loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "She spent years cleaning office buildings and school cafeterias." The woman in white blinked with obvious surprise. "Seriously?" Olivia laughed lightly. "Oh yes, Margaret is extremely humble. Honestly, I think this is the fanciest hotel she has ever stepped foot inside." Several people chuckled softly. One of the executives shook his head while smiling into his drink. "Well, Ethan certainly upgraded the family lifestyle." More laughter followed. My chest tightened painfully. I stared down at my plate while pretending not to notice. The woman beside Olivia tilted her head sympathetically. "That must be overwhelming for her." Olivia gave another polished little laugh. "You should have seen her face when the valet opened the car door earlier. I thought she was going to apologize for touching the leather seats." The group burst into louder laughter this time. Even people nearby who clearly did not know the conversation still smiled automatically because everyone else was laughing. My fingers slowly tightened around the fork in my hand. I could physically hear my heartbeat now. Across the ballroom, Ethan finally turned toward the sound of the laughter. For one desperate second, I thought maybe this time he would stop it. Instead, he gave Olivia a quick, uncomfortable smile like he wanted the moment to pass quietly without conflict. Then he looked away again. Something inside me cracked completely after that. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small, painful realization settling deep in my chest. My son was embarrassed by me. I suddenly remembered standing outside grocery stores during Ohio winters waiting for buses after double shifts because I could not afford parking downtown. I remembered sleeping 4 hours a night for years while balancing cleaning contracts and cafeteria work just so Ethan could attend better schools. I remembered mailing rent checks late because SAT tutoring classes came first. And somehow none of those sacrifices mattered in this ballroom tonight because all these people could see was an older woman in an inexpensive dress sitting beside the kitchen doors. I quietly reached for my purse beneath the table. The room suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too humiliating. Nobody would even notice if I slipped out early. In fact, part of me believed leaving might actually make things easier for Ethan. I slowly stood from my chair while another round of applause echoed near the stage. My eyes drifted toward the ballroom exit across the marble lobby entrance. I only needed to make it about 40 feet without drawing attention to myself. But just as I took my first step away from table 39, the giant ballroom doors suddenly opened, and the entire atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. The ballroom noise faded almost instantly the moment the elderly man stepped through the entrance doors. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses lowered slowly. Even the waiters seemed to pause in place. I turned toward the lobby in trance along with everyone else and immediately recognized the reaction spreading across the room before I recognized the man himself. People were staring at him the way ordinary people stare at presidents or movie stars. The older gentleman walked carefully with a black cane and wore a dark charcoal tuxedo tailored so perfectly it somehow made every younger executive in the room look underdressed. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and despite his age, there was something powerful about the way he carried himself. Quiet power, the kind that did not need attention because it already owned the room the second it arrived. Then I heard someone whisper near the front tables. "That is Leonard Graves." Another voice answered immediately. "No way. He never attends public events anymore." My stomach tightened slightly because even I knew that name. Leonard Graves was the billionaire founder of Graves Mercer Consulting, the firm Ethan had spent the last 11 years working for. Business magazines constantly called him one of the most influential executives in America. Rumors said he had not attended a company gala in nearly 6 years due to health problems. Across the ballroom, Ethan looked completely stunned. Olivia straightened instantly beside him while several executives hurried toward the entrance with excited smiles. "Mr. Graves," one senior partner said enthusiastically while extending his hand. "What an incredible surprise." Leonard barely acknowledged him. His eyes moved slowly across the ballroom, like he was searching for someone specific. Olivia stepped forward next, practically glowing with nervous excitement. "Mr. Graves, it is such an honor to finally meet you in person," she said warmly. "We are so grateful you came tonight." But Leonard still did not respond. Instead, his eyes suddenly locked directly onto me, standing near the back aisle beside table 39 with my purse still hanging from my shoulder. The expression on his face changed immediately. Complete shock. For one confusing second, I honestly thought he must be looking at someone behind me. But then Leonard took several slow steps forward without looking at anyone else around him. The entire ballroom watched silently while this 82-year-old billionaire ignored executives, investors, and senior partners just to walk toward the back corner, where I stood frozen in confusion. Olivia's smile slowly disappeared. Ethan looked completely lost. Leonard stopped less than 3 feet in front of me and stared at my face carefully like he could not fully believe what he was seeing. "Margaret Hayes?" he asked softly. My heart skipped painfully. I had not heard that voice in almost 3 decades, but I recognized it instantly anyway. "Leonard," I whispered back in disbelief. A wave of confused murmurs spread across the ballroom immediately. Several executives exchanged stunned looks with one another, while photographers instinctively lifted their cameras. Leonard looked around the room slowly before his eyes landed on table 39 behind me. His expression darkened almost immediately. "Why are you standing back here?" he asked quietly. I forced a small, uncomfortable smile. "Oh, I was actually just leaving." Leonard frowned deeply. "Leaving?" Then he glanced again toward the small table beside the kitchen doors, and his entire face changed. "Wait." His voice suddenly sounded sharper now. "That is where they seated you." The silence inside the ballroom became almost unbearable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Olivia's face had gone completely pale near the front tables. Ethan looked trapped somewhere between confusion and panic. I quickly shook my head, desperate to stop whatever was happening. "Leonard, please," I whispered softly. "It is fine." But he kept staring at table 39 with visible disbelief. Then he slowly turned toward the center of the ballroom and asked a question so calmly that somehow made it even more terrifying. "Does anyone in this room actually know who this woman is?" The silence after Leonard's question felt suffocating. Hundreds of people stood frozen beneath the ballroom lights, while nobody seemed brave enough to answer him. I could physically feel every eye in the room moving between Leonard Graves and me like people were trying to solve a mystery they suddenly realized they should have understood hours ago. Leonard slowly turned his gaze toward the executives near the front tables. "No," he asked again calmly. "None of you." One senior partner cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Graves, we know she is Ethan Hayes' mother." Leonard stared at him for several long seconds before giving a quiet nod. "Yes," he said softly. "She is." Then his expression hardened slightly. "But that is not why this woman matters." A ripple of uneasy whispers spread through the ballroom. Ethan stepped forward carefully now, clearly trying to understand what was happening. "Mr. Graves," he said respectfully, "how do you know my mother?" Leonard looked at Ethan with an unreadable expression. "Your mother and I met 28 years ago," he answered quietly. "Back when this company barely existed." Confused murmurs immediately spread again. Olivia folded her arms tightly across her waist while trying to maintain composure, but I could see panic beginning to creep across her face. Leonard turned back toward me. "Margaret," he said gently, "do they really not know?" I immediately shook my head. "Leonard, please. Tonight is Ethan's night." But Leonard ignored me completely. Instead, he slowly walked toward the center of the ballroom floor while guests moved aside instinctively to let him pass. The entire room followed him with silent attention. He stopped beside the stage and looked directly at the giant company logo glowing across the LED screen overhead. 28 years ago, he began calmly. This company operated out of a rented office smaller than most Manhattan apartments. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink anymore. Leonard continued speaking while his voice echoed softly through the ballroom speakers. We had 12 employees. Half our investors were preparing to pull out. Payroll was 3 days from collapsing entirely. Several older executives looked stunned because clearly they had never heard this story before either. Leonard slowly turned back toward me. And during that exact week, Margaret Hayes walked into our office building every night after midnight to clean floors. A few guests exchanged confused glances immediately. Leonard nodded once. Most people never noticed her. That was the problem with Margaret. She spent her entire life helping people quietly. I lowered my eyes uncomfortably. Ethan looked completely frozen beside Olivia now. Leonard pointed gently toward me again. One night she found me sitting alone in that office, staring at unpaid bills spread across a folding table because I genuinely believed the company was finished. The room remained completely silent, except for the faint hum of the ballroom lights overhead. Margaret asked me what was wrong, Leonard continued. I told her the truth. We needed $150,000 within 72 hours, or the company would disappear. Audible gasps spread through several nearby tables. Back then, $150,000 might as well have been $1 million to people like us. Leonard looked directly at Ethan now. Do you know what your mother did after hearing that? Ethan swallowed hard, but said nothing. Leonard answered for him anyway. She came back 2 days later carrying a cashier's check for the exact amount. The entire ballroom exploded into stunned whispers instantly. Olivia's eyes widened so dramatically it looked like she physically stopped breathing for a second. One executive actually laughed softly in disbelief. That is impossible, he muttered under his breath. Leonard immediately looked toward him. You are right, he said sharply. It should have been impossible. Then his eyes returned to Ethan again. Because your mother earned less than $30,000 a year at the time. My chest tightened painfully. I could already feel where this conversation was heading, and I wanted desperately for it to stop before the truth became public. But Leonard kept speaking anyway. The only reason Margaret had that money, he said quietly, is because she sold the house she spent 17 years paying for by herself. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers, so loudly it almost sounded like waves crashing against the walls. People were no longer pretending not to stare at me. Executives who ignored me all evening suddenly looked completely stunned, while photographers hurried closer near the stage. Ethan stood motionless beside Olivia, like his entire understanding of his own life had just shifted beneath his feet. Mom, he said quietly, almost unable to speak. What is he talking about? I could not look at him. My hands tightened around my purse while memories I spent decades burying suddenly rushed back all at once. The tiny house in Cleveland with a leaking kitchen ceiling. The overdue utility notices hidden inside drawers, so Ethan would not worry. Working overnight, cleaning contracts until my knees ached so badly, some mornings I struggled climbing apartment stairs. I never wanted Ethan carrying the weight of those years. I wanted him to believe his future came from his own talent, not from sacrifice. Leonard slowly walked back toward me again while the entire ballroom remained locked in silence. Margaret sold her home on a Thursday morning, he said softly, and by Friday afternoon she placed a check on my desk. One older executive near the front shook his head in disbelief. Why would anyone do that for a company they did not even own? Leonard gave a sad smile. Because she believed people deserved second chances. Then he looked directly at Ethan. And because she believed her son deserved a future bigger than the life she had. Ethan's eyes watered immediately. Olivia looked physically shaken now. Earlier that evening she laughed about my discount store dress and old purse. Now, she stood beside people staring at me like I was someone entirely different. One of the women who laughed earlier quietly lowered her champagne glass and avoided eye contact completely. Leonard continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. I told Margaret she was making a terrible decision, he admitted. I explained there was a high chance the company would still fail anyway. A faint, uncomfortable laugh escaped somewhere near the back tables. Leonard nodded once. And honestly, at the time, I agreed with him. It sounded insane. He paused briefly, but Margaret looked me straight in the eye and said something I've never forgotten. The ballroom grew even quieter somehow. She said, "If this company survives, maybe families like mine will finally have opportunities people usually save for the wealthy." My throat tightened painfully hearing those words repeated out loud after so many years. Ethan looked completely shattered now. "You sold our house?" he whispered. I finally looked at him. "You were applying to colleges," I answered softly. "I did not want you worrying about money." Ethan blinked several times, rapidly, like he was trying not to lose composure publicly. "You told me the house sale happened because the market improved." I forced a tiny smile. It sounded easier that way. Several guests nearby visibly reacted to that sentence. One woman actually covered her mouth emotionally. Leonard sighed quietly before continuing. After the sale closed, Margaret spent almost 11 months sleeping on a cousin's sofa while continuing to work 2 jobs. Ethan looked physically sick hearing that. "No," he whispered immediately. "No, that cannot be true." I stepped forward quickly, desperate to stop the conversation from going further. "Ethan, please," I said gently. It was a long time ago, but Leonard's expression darkened slightly. "No," he said firmly. "Tonight people in this room laughed at this woman like she was something embarrassing." His voice echoed sharply enough that several executives immediately shifted uncomfortably. Olivia's face had completely lost color now. Leonard slowly looked around the ballroom. Meanwhile, half the opportunities sitting in this room exist because Margaret Hayes sacrificed everything before any of you even knew this company's name. The silence afterward felt almost unbearable. Then Leonard turned toward the audiovisual team near the giant LED screen. "Actually," he said calmly, "there's something else these people deserve to see." My heart dropped instantly because suddenly I knew exactly what he meant. "Leonard," I whispered urgently, "please do not." But he ignored me completely. "Play the archive footage from 1998. The massive LED screen flickered once above the ballroom stage, and suddenly the elegant company logo disappeared. Grainy video footage replaced it instead. The room remained completely silent except for the low hum of the projector overhead. I closed my eyes briefly because I already knew what people were about to see. A timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen. October 14th, 1998. The footage looked old and slightly distorted, recorded back when security cameras captured everything in washed-out colors and blurry movement. A younger version of Leonard appeared sitting alone inside a tiny office, surrounded by stacks of paper and unpaid invoices spread across a folding table. The room looked nothing like the billion-dollar company headquarters everyone knew today. The carpet looked stained. The walls were plain white. Half the overhead lights barely worked. Then the office door opened slowly on screen, and suddenly the entire ballroom saw me. Not the older woman standing quietly near the stage tonight. The younger version. Tired eyes. Cheap blue janitor uniform. Hair tied back carelessly after a double shift. I heard several people in the ballroom gasp softly. Ethan stared up at the screen like he could barely recognize me. In the footage, I stepped carefully into Leonard's office carrying a plastic cleaning bucket in one hand while asking if he was still working late. Leonard laughed quietly beside me in the present ballroom. She used to bring me coffee every Thursday night because she knew I stayed there until morning worrying about payroll. On screen, younger Leonard rubbed his face with exhaustion while explaining financial numbers spread across the desk. The audio quality sounded rough, but everyone could still hear enough. "We are done," younger Leonard admitted in the footage. "If I cannot find emergency funding by Monday, the company closes." Then the younger version of me sat quietly across from him while listening carefully. No dramatic music, no speeches, just a tired woman in a janitor uniform listening to a struggling businessman talk about failure at 2 o'clock in the morning. The footage skipped forward slightly. Another timestamp appeared. 2 days later. The ballroom remained frozen in complete silence while the younger version of me walked back into Leonard's office, carrying an envelope. Leonard on screen immediately stood up in confusion. "Margaret, what is this?" he asked. Younger me pushed the envelope toward him across the desk. "You said the company needs $150,000. Leonard slowly opened the envelope in the video. Even through grainy footage, the shock on his face looked obvious. "Margaret," he whispered immediately. "No." Younger me smiled faintly on screen. "You said families could have opportunities here one day." Leonard shook his head repeatedly in the footage. "You cannot give me this. This is everything." Then younger me answered with words I had completely forgotten until this exact moment. "My son deserves a future bigger than cleaning floors." The ballroom fell even quieter somehow after hearing that sentence. Ethan covered his mouth with one hand while tears filled his eyes instantly. Olivia looked completely shattered beside him. Around the room, executives who spent the entire evening networking and laughing now stared at the screen with visible guilt written across their faces. The footage continued playing. Younger Leonard looked emotional even back then, while pushing the envelope back across the desk. "At least take ownership shares," he insisted. "If this company survives, you deserve part of it." Several people in the ballroom leaned forward immediately after hearing that. The younger version of me shook my head without hesitation. "No," I answered softly on screen. "Just promise me one thing instead." Present day, Leonard looked around the ballroom slowly. "Most people in this room know about the Graves Mercer Scholarship Foundation," he said quietly. "The program that paid tuition for more than 4,000 low-income students over the last 20 years. His eyes moved directly toward Ethan now. "Your mother created that idea in this office before this company ever became successful." The footage on the screen finally faded to black, but nobody inside the ballroom moved afterward. It felt like the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Hundreds of wealthy guests stood frozen beneath the chandeliers while the truth settled over them piece by piece. Moments earlier, many of these same people had laughed quietly about my dress, my purse, and my old jobs. Now they were staring at me with expressions that looked almost ashamed. Ethan slowly stepped away from the stage area without taking his eyes off me. His face looked completely broken. "Mom," he whispered again, but this time his voice sounded smaller somehow, like he had suddenly become a little boy again instead of a successful executive standing in a Manhattan ballroom. I could already see the guilt spreading across his face, and honestly that hurt me more than Olivia's cruelty ever could. I never wanted Ethan to feel responsible for my sacrifices. That was the entire reason I hid them from him in the first place. Leonard remained standing near the stage while silence continued swallowing the room. Then one older executive near the front finally spoke. "Wait," he said slowly. "You were saying the Scholarship Foundation started because of her?" Leonard nodded once. "Margaret did not want stock options. She did not want recognition. She only wanted struggling families to have opportunities their children normally would never receive." Several people visibly reacted to that sentence. A woman near the center tables wiped tears from her face quietly. Another executive stared down at his wine glass like he physically could not look at me anymore. Ethan finally reached me near the back aisle. His eyes were red now. "Why would you never tell me any of this?" he asked softly. I forced a small smile, even though my chest felt painfully tight. "Because you deserve to build your life without feeling indebted to me." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No," he whispered. "No, I should have known." Around us, guests continued staring silently, while photographers lowered their cameras almost respectfully now. Nobody wanted to interrupt this moment anymore. Olivia stood several feet away, looking completely lost. The confident woman who spent the entire evening controlling social conversations and smiling for executives had vanished entirely. She looked pale beneath the ballroom lights. Smaller somehow. Leonard slowly walked toward us again while leaning lightly on his cane. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. I immediately closed my eyes for half a second because I already knew where this was going next. "Leonard," I whispered, "please stop." But he shook his head gently. "No, Margaret. They deserve the full truth tonight." Ethan turned toward him slowly. "What else is there?" Leonard looked directly at Ethan now. "The company survived because of your mother's money," he said calmly. But Graves Mercer became successful because of your mother's ideas. Confused murmurs spread across the ballroom immediately. Leonard pointed toward the giant company slogan displayed beside the stage. Opportunity changes everything. That phrase, he said quietly. Margaret came up with it during one of our late-night conversations in that office. Several executives looked visibly stunned. Leonard continued. The scholarship initiative that later became the foundation, Margaret designed the structure herself. Ethan blinked repeatedly, like he was struggling to process everything at once. My mother created the foundation? Leonard nodded. Most of the programs this company proudly advertises about supporting working families came from conversations with her nearly 3 decades ago. Olivia's breathing looked uneven now. Earlier that evening, she mocked me for shopping at discount stores and cleaning office buildings. Meanwhile, the entire corporate culture she spent years admiring partially existed because of the woman she tried to hide beside the kitchen doors. Leonard sighed softly before adding something that made the entire ballroom fall silent all over again. Frankly, he admitted, without Margaret Hayes, there's a very good chance none of you would even have jobs at this company today. Nobody inside the ballroom seemed capable of returning to normal conversation anymore. The energy of the entire evening had completely transformed. Earlier, people were networking, laughing, and discussing promotions beneath glowing chandeliers. Now hundreds of guests stood in emotional silence while staring at me like they were seeing a completely different person than the woman they dismissed beside the kitchen doors less than an hour ago. Ethan remained directly in front of me, his eyes still wet. I could see him replaying memories in real time now. The old apartment after we sold the house. The years I told him I preferred taking buses because parking downtown was too stressful. The Christmas mornings where I somehow still managed gifts despite unpaid bills hidden in kitchen drawers. Suddenly, all the small pieces of his childhood probably looked different to him now. Mom, he whispered painfully, all those years, you were struggling that badly? I immediately shook my head. No, I said softly. We survived. But Ethan's expression collapsed even more because deep down he knew surviving was not the same thing as living comfortably. Leonard stood quietly nearby before speaking again. Margaret never wanted pity, he explained calmly to the room. In fact, she spent 28 years making sure nobody knew any of this. One executive near the stage frowned slightly. But if she helped build the company this much, why was she never publicly recognized? Leonard gave a sad smile. Because every single time we tried, she refused. More confused murmurs spread through the ballroom. Leonard nodded once. We offered her speaking roles, board advisory positions, public recognition campaigns. She turned down all of them. Then his eyes moved toward me gently. Margaret believed the opportunities mattered more than her name attached to them. Olivia lowered her eyes immediately after hearing that. The contrast between us now felt impossible to ignore. Earlier, she worried endlessly about appearances, status, and how people perceived the family image. Meanwhile, the woman she treated like an embarrassment spent decades quietly changing thousands of lives without asking anyone to even know her name. One younger executive suddenly spoke from the middle tables. Wait, he said slowly. If she refused ownership shares back then. He hesitated before finishing the question. What would those shares even be worth today? The ballroom instantly grew quieter again. I closed my eyes briefly because I hated where this conversation always led. Leonard looked toward the executive calmly. At today's company valuation, he paused for half a second. Approximately $430 million. Audible gasps exploded throughout the room immediately. Someone near the front actually whispered, "Dear God." Ethan stared at me in complete disbelief. You turned down $400 million? I looked down at my hands uncomfortably. It was never about money. Several guests physically looked unable to process that answer. One investor shook his head slowly while muttering under his breath. Nobody says no to that kind of money. Leonard looked directly at him. That is exactly why Margaret Hayes is different from almost everyone in this room. Silence followed immediately after that sentence. Ethan ran one trembling hand across his face while trying to hold himself together emotionally. "You could have been one of the wealthiest women in America," he whispered. I forced a tiny smile. "And you could have grown up believing money mattered more than kindness." Ethan looked like those words hit him harder than anything else tonight. Across the ballroom, people who once ignored me now seemed deeply uncomfortable standing near me at all. The woman in the emerald dress avoided eye contact completely. Several executives who laughed earlier suddenly looked ashamed whenever their eyes accidentally met mine. The social hierarchy inside the room had reversed so completely it almost felt unreal. Then, before the silence could settle again, Olivia suddenly stepped forward for the first time in several minutes. Her voice sounded shaky now. "Margaret," she said softly, I did not know." I looked at her quietly without answering right away. Earlier tonight, she laughed about my old purse and discount store clothes while trying to hide me from executives. Now her entire expression looked fragile beneath the ballroom lights. But before I could respond, Leonard turned slowly toward her and asked one calm question that made the entire room tense all over again. "Would you have treated her differently if you had known she was worth $400 million?